I'm Ellen Mercer, and I was never the kind of woman who wanted to stand out at a wedding. I'm 58, a hospital accountant who prefers quiet corners, soft music, and letting the younger folks take the spotlight. But on the night my son got married, I found myself standing in the middle of a ballroom filled with 200 people, my hands shaking against a linen tablecloth, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. The chandeliers above us flickered against the gold trim of the room, throwing light over the crystal glasses and white roses arranged like something out of a magazine. I remember thinking how beautiful it all looked, how proud Daniel had been when he first saw the space, how his eyes had softened when Lily walked down the aisle. For a moment, I let myself believe the night would stay gentle. Then her father stood up. Richard Hartman held the microphone like he owned the air in the room. His tuxedo was pressed within an inch of its life, his smile wide enough to pass for charm if you didn't look too closely. I watched him lift his champagne flute and saw the crowd lean in, expecting one of those grand speeches rich men love to give. But all I heard was the crack in my son's breathing when the words landed. "That boy is an idiot if he thinks love can pay the bills." People laughed, real laughs, sharp, nervous, eager to please the man paying for the venue. Daniel didn't lift his head. Lily froze beside him, her fingers tightening around his hand as if she could hold him together. My heart split clean down the center, and in that silence, right after the laughter died, something inside me rose: anger, fear, love. I still don't know. I only know I pushed back my chair, stood up, and began walking toward that microphone. I had tried to stay quiet. God knows I had tried, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd learned about Richard Hartman. Not tonight. 6 months before that wedding night, before the ballroom lights and the humiliation that would split my son open, Daniel knocked on my front door holding a casserole dish and wearing the kind of smile a man only gets when he's in love. I knew something was different the moment he stepped inside. His shoulders were straighter. His eyes carried a glow I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, building Lego bridges across our living room floor. "Mom," he said, shifting the dish in his hands, "there's someone I want you to meet." I was stirring a pot of soup on the stove, the smell of thyme and slow-cooked chicken filling the kitchen. My house isn't big, just 2 bedrooms, creaky floorboards, and a window that whines when the wind changes. But it has always been the one place Daniel said felt safe. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the front door wider. And there she was. Lily stood on my porch with her hair tucked behind one ear, holding a small bouquet of grocery store daisies, like she wasn't sure if she should bring flowers to meet the mother of the man she hoped to marry. She had the soft warmth of a person who'd learned to make herself smaller in her own home. I recognized that quiet immediately. I'd lived it once. "Hi, Mrs. Mercer," she said, offering the daisies. "Daniel told me you like simple flowers." I liked her right away. Dinner that night was humble. Roasted chicken thighs, potatoes, green beans, nothing that took more than a few steps or more than one grocery trip. Lily helped me set the table. Daniel carried plates with the same care he used to carry his school projects. The two of them whispered to each other while they poured iced tea, brushing hands as if every touch confirmed something real between them. During dessert, Lily told me she worked as an elementary school teacher. I watched her talk about her students, her face lighting up when she mentioned the child who'd finally learned to read after months of struggling. Daniel looked at her like she was a lighthouse in the fog. Then she mentioned her parents. "My dad's in real estate development," she said lightly. "He builds housing units for the city. Affordable stuff. He's very successful." The hesitation in her voice didn't escape me. I'd seen that same pause in women who both love and fear disappointing the men in their lives. But I let it go. People are complicated. Families even more so. and it was too early to form judgments. 2 weeks later, Lily invited us to her parents' home for dinner. I knew from the tone in her voice that she was nervous about it. Daniel tried to pretend it was no big deal, but the way he straightened his jacket 3 times before we walked to the car said otherwise. Their house wasn't a house. It was a statement. A gated entrance. Long driveway. Fountains. The kind of manicured lawn that probably required its own team of groundskeepers. When Lily opened the door from the inside, she looked relieved to see us, like she'd been holding her breath and could finally let it out. Dad's in the study. Mom's helping the server with appetizers, she said, ushering us in. Please, just make yourselves comfortable. Comfortable wasn't the word I would have chosen. I felt like a piece of furniture had walked into the wrong showroom. Caroline, her mother, floated into the room wearing pearls and a smile so polite it barely touched her eyes. She kissed Lily's cheek, shook my hand, and introduced herself with the calm gentleness of a woman who spent her life smoothing over her husband's edges. Dinner was served by a young man in a black apron, shrimp cocktail, a salad drizzled with something I couldn't pronounce, then steak cooked so rare I wondered if it still remembered being alive. The chandelier above the table cast a golden glow over everything, making the room look like a magazine spread titled, Families Who Don't Worry About Mortgage Payments. Richard arrived late. He strode into the dining room like he was entering a board meeting he knew he owned. His handshake was firm. Too firm, the kind meant to size up a person before he ever asked their name. So, he said as he cut into his steak, Daniel tells me he's a structural engineer. Not bad, not remarkable, but not bad. Daniel's fork paused midair. I felt something twist in my stomach. And you, Ellen, Richard continued, you work at the hospital, right? Accounting? He raised an eyebrow as if waiting for me to apologize for not being more, good. Numbers are important, even for smaller systems. Lily closed her eyes for a second, and I realized she wasn't hearing these words for the first time. He asked about Daniel's salary, his car, whether he owned property. He asked with the casual cruelty of a man who had spent a lifetime measuring others by what they lacked. By dessert. Daniel's smile had faded. Lily's hands were trembling. Caroline kept sipping wine like it was a shield. As we got up to leave, Richard stepped out onto the patio with me under the pretense of seeing us off. The night air was cold. The lake behind the house shimmered under the moonlight. He seems like a nice enough guy, Richard said, lighting a cigar. But my daughter was raised for more. I just hope he knows what she's accustomed to. I didn't answer. I didn't trust myself to. But on the car ride home, with Daniel gripping the steering wheel too tightly and Lily staring out the window in silence, I felt a small, sharp seed of worry plant itself deep in my chest. I didn't know then how fast that seed would grow, or how dark the roots would be. A month after that dinner, when the air had cooled and the leaves along my street had turned brittle and red, I began noticing a change in Daniel. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind of shift only a mother would see. He'd come over for Sunday lunch and push his food around his plate, distracted. When I asked what was wrong, he'd tell me he was tired from work, but his eyes drifted the way they used to when he was a boy trying to hide a bad grade. One afternoon, as I walked out of the hospital after a long shift, I stopped at the small grocery store across the street to pick up oranges. I was standing in the produce aisle choosing a bag when I heard a familiar laugh, deep, confident, tinged with superiority. I didn't look up at first. Cleveland is full of voices that echo each other, but when I heard it again, close enough to prick my skin, I turned. There was Richard. He wasn't wearing the polished suit from that dinner. He wore jeans, a leather jacket, and a smile so relaxed it shocked me. Beside him stood a woman in her mid-30s with glossy hair and an expensive stroller. Two children, a boy maybe 5 and a girl barely 3, were tugging at Richard's pant leg like they'd known him all their lives. "Daddy, can we get the cereal with the tiger?" the little boy asked. The word hit me like a door slamming. Richard laughed, ruffled the boy's hair, and steered him toward the cereal aisle as if this was the most natural scene in the world. The woman leaned into Richard's arm the way a wife would. They looked like a family on a casual Saturday outing, comfortable, familiar, practiced in each other's presence. I froze behind a display of canned tomatoes, my heart pounding hard enough to make my fingers shake. I watched him introduce the woman as a family friend to the cashier when she made a passing comment about the kids. I watched him carry a bag to the car like a man who'd done it 1,000 times, and I knew, with a certainty that made me nauseous, that this wasn't some affair he'd stumbled into. This was another household, a second life, a life he'd built while Caroline floated through charity events and Lily planned her future with my son. I walked to my car in a fog. The oranges slipped from my hands onto the passenger seat, and I sat there for minutes, trying to steady my breath. My first instinct was to tell Daniel. My second was to question everything I'd seen. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But the longer I sat there, the heavier reality pressed on my chest. I needed facts, not guesses. I'd lived through the consequences of assuming too much and speaking too little. My ex-husband had drained our savings right under my nose because I'd convinced myself that good people don't lie. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. The next morning, I asked a colleague at work, an older woman named Judy, if she knew any private investigators. She raised an eyebrow, probably imagining something far more dramatic than the truth. But she didn't pry. She dug into her purse, pulled out an old business card, and slid it across my desk. "Marco Ruiz," she said. "He helped my cousin with a custody issue. Good man, discreet." 2 days later, I climbed a narrow set of stairs above a pawn shop downtown, following the peeling letters on a door, "Ruiz Investigations." Inside. The office smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. A desk lamp hummed quietly. A half-filled file cabinet leaned against the wall like it was tired of holding other people's secrets. Marco was tall, with tired eyes and a polite patience that made me feel less embarrassed about being there. I told him everything. Dinner at the Hartmans, Richard's comments, Daniel's sudden self-doubt, and the scene at the grocery store. Marco didn't interrupt. He just listened, nodding now and then, jotting down notes in a worn leather notebook. When I finished, he leaned back. "Mrs. Mercer," he said gently, "I can look into this, but you should know. Men who juggle 2 families don't usually stop at lies. There's often money involved, sometimes a lot of it." I swallowed hard. I don't care about his money. I care about my son. Marco studied me for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of my words, then laid out what he would need: the retainer fee, a few signed forms, and time. 4 weeks, at least. Maybe more. I paid him from my small retirement fund. I didn't tell Daniel. I couldn't. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. Walking out of that office, I felt the weight of a decision I couldn't undo. The late autumn wind cut across my face, sharper than before, as if the city itself was warning me to turn back. But I kept walking. Part of me already knew that once Richard Hartman's life began to unravel, it wouldn't stop with just him, and as much as I hated it, I understood something I hadn't dared admit aloud. Whatever truth Marco found, it could break my son's heart long before it ever saved him. Marco kept his word. Over the next several weeks, he sent updates sparingly, always short, always careful. A text here, a voicemail there. Nothing dramatic, just steady pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would change everything I thought I knew about the man my son was about to call family. The nights felt longer during that time. I'd sit at my kitchen table with a mug of chamomile tea, watching headlights sweep across my curtains, wondering what Marco was seeing, what he was documenting. The quiet hum of the refrigerator became a kind of companion, reminding me how empty a house can be when you're waiting for news you're afraid to receive. One cold morning, nearly 5 weeks into the investigation, Marco called and asked if he could come by. His voice carried a seriousness that made my stomach tighten. I baked a tray of blueberry muffins, not because he needed them, but because I needed something to do with my hands. When he arrived, he took off his coat and set a manila folder on the table with a soft thud that felt louder than any explosion. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked at me with that same patience he'd shown the first day. "This isn't easy to see," he said, "but you hired me to find the truth, so I brought you the truth." He slid the folder toward me. Inside were photographs, grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Richard walking out of an apartment building with the woman from the grocery store. Richard loading bags into the trunk of a car while the 2 children climbed inside. Richard using a company credit card at a boutique toy store. A receipt showing thousands spent on rent for a downtown apartment under a corporate housing account. My breath stalled in my chest. Marco handed me another sheet. Handwritten notes detailing conversations he'd overheard, mentions of weekly payments, a private school inquiry under a false name, a city inspector so frustrated with unfinished units in one of Richard's affordable housing projects that he threatened to file a complaint. I placed my hand on the table to steady myself. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in. So he really has... I couldn't finish the sentence. "A second family," Marco said quietly. "Yes, and he's using corporate funds to support them. That's where it gets serious." I felt a rush of heat, anger, disbelief, grief for Lily, for Caroline, for Daniel, who had never once imagined he might be marrying into a house built on lies. Marco waited while I closed the folder and rested both hands on top of it like I was trying to keep the truth from spilling out across my kitchen floor. "What do I do with this?" I whispered. Marco hesitated. "That depends on what outcome you want. If this goes to the authorities, Richard could face charges: fraud, embezzlement, misuse of city grant funds. But if you go public too soon, before the DA is ready, he'll bury everything. Men like him don't fall quietly." His words settled like cold ash. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I want my son to have a chance at a real life, a clean life. I don't want him humiliated in front of people who pretend to care about him. I've lived that. I don't want him to." Marco nodded slowly. "Then talk to someone you trust legally, quietly. Someone who knows how to handle men like Hartman." I didn't have to think long. I knew exactly who to call. The next afternoon, I met Assistant District Attorney Alicia Nguyen at a small cafe near the courthouse. We had worked together once before, years back, when the hospital uncovered tax irregularities involving one of the administrators. I had testified. She had remembered me as the woman who told the truth even when it cost her sleep. Alicia listened intently as I slid the folder across the table. She didn't say much while flipping through the photos, but the crease between her brows deepened. When she reached the receipts, she exhaled slowly. "This is bad," she said. "Not just morally, legally. If you use city grant money for personal expenses, that's fraud on multiple levels." I expected her to jump into action, to call someone, to launch something official. She didn't. She closed the folder gently, folded her hands on top of it, and studied me. "Ellen, why bring this to me? Why not confront your son? Or Lily? Why now?" Her voice wasn't accusing. It was careful, almost tender. And for the first time in years, I felt the sting of old wounds rising, the lies my ex-husband told, the nights I cried over bills I didn't know he'd hidden, the shame of protecting a man who didn't deserve protecting. "Because I stayed silent once," I said quietly. "And it destroyed everything. I won't let my son build a life on top of someone else's deception." Alicia nodded, understanding more than I'd said. "I can open an inquiry," she said. "Not a full case yet, a quiet one. If we move too fast, he'll smell it. Men like Hartman have lawyers on retainer who would bury this in a heartbeat. Let me take this back and do it right." I left the cafe with the winter wind stinging my cheeks, but not from the cold. Something heavier followed me home. Responsibility. The kind that settles on your shoulders and refuses to let you stand straight. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, the folder now in Alicia's hands, I realized something I hadn't dared admit to myself. The road I had just stepped onto, there was no way off it. And sooner or later, my son would be the one standing in the path of whatever came next. When I rose from my chair that night, I felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward me, though the only face I truly saw was my son's. Daniel sat there with his head lowered, trying to hide the sting of Richard's words, and something inside me snapped cleanly, like a branch that had carried too much weight for too long. I didn't think about the consequences or the whispers that would follow. I only knew I couldn't let him drown beneath a lie spoken by a man who had spent years building his life on them. I walked toward the stage, feeling the soft carpet shift under my shoes. Richard looked almost amused when he saw me coming, as if I were merely an interruption he could swat away. He lifted the microphone again, preparing for another joke, but I laid my hand over his and felt him stiffen. The music faded. The chatter died. It was as though the entire room leaned in to hear whatever came next. "That man," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "has no right to call anyone an idiot." A hush spread through the tables. For a moment, no one moved. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse wildly. I simply told the truth I had carried alone for weeks. I told them about the apartment downtown, the woman who smiled too comfortably at Richard's side, the 2 children who reached for him without hesitation. I told them about the company funds he used to support them, the unfinished housing project meant for families who needed safety, not fraud. I told them what I had seen, what Marco had documented, and what Richard had tried to bury beneath polished speeches and carefully chosen suits. Lily opened her envelope first. Her breath left her body in a sound that cut through me. Caroline followed. She lifted a hand to her mouth, eyes trembling as she stared at the photos. The room shifted around Richard, the admiration draining until only disbelief remained. He tried to call me unstable, jealous, desperate to ruin a celebration. But the evidence spoke louder than he ever could. People who had laughed moments earlier now stared at him with a mixture of disgust and dawning realization. Daniel stood then, stepping between us. His voice wasn't angry, it was heartbreakingly calm. He told Richard that love didn't make him an idiot, and ambition didn't make Richard a man. He turned to Lily and promised he would not begin their life together with lies hanging over them. Lily collapsed into his arms, torn between grief and relief, and I knew the truth had struck exactly where it needed to. The wedding ended early. No dancing, no final toast, just quiet acknowledgement that something rotten had finally been brought into the light. Months later, the investigation began. Richard was charged. Caroline rebuilt her life. Lily and Daniel married again in a small lakeside ceremony where nothing glittered except sincerity. And as I watched them say their vows under an open sky, I understood the only certainty I had left. Sometimes the truth destroys, but sometimes it saves.